I am Richard Harrison, 70 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my own flesh and blood inflicted. As the founder of a successful logistics empire, I thought I had secured my family's future, entrusting my son with my life's work. Last Tuesday, I dropped him off at the airport for what I believed was a crucial business trip. We hugged, he smiled, and I drove away full of pride. Half an hour later, my housekeeper of 10 years sent me a frantic text. She wrote, "Do not go home, check the cameras now." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The drop-off lane at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport is always a relentless storm of honking cabs rushing travelers and the heavy, suffocating scent of exhaust fumes. But on that crisp Tuesday morning, I did not mind the chaos. I sat in the driver's seat of my SUV looking at my 38-year-old son, Derek, as he pulled his sleek leather overnight bag from the trunk. He was dressed impeccably in a tailored navy suit, looking every inch the formidable vice president of Harrison Logistics. He was supposed to be walking into that terminal, navigating the security lines and boarding a first-class British Airways flight directly to London. We were on the verge of losing a massive international supply chain contract, a deal that could make or break our quarterly projections, and Derek had insisted on flying out to handle the negotiations personally. He closed the trunk and walked up to my open window. The morning sun caught his confident, easy smile. He leaned in, resting his hands on the doorframe. "I will not let you down, Dad." He told me, his voice carrying that smooth, reassuring tone he had perfected over the years. "You built this company from nothing, and I am going to make sure we do not lose this account. Go home, get some rest. I will call you the second I land at Heathrow." I smiled back at him, feeling a deep, profound swell of pride expanding in my chest. I reached out and squeezed his shoulder. "You have a good flight, son," I said. "Close the deal. Show them what a Harrison can do." He gave me one last nod, turned and disappeared into the sprawling crowds pouring through the automatic sliding doors of the international terminal. I shifted the car into drive and slowly merged back into the relentless flow of morning airport traffic. As I pulled onto Interstate 85 heading north toward Buckhead, I let out a long, contented breath. The radio played softly in the background, a low murmur of classic jazz that filled the quiet space of the cabin. For the first time in a long time, I felt a genuine sense of peace about the future. I looked down at my hands, gripping the leather steering wheel. They were weathered, spotted with age, and lined with thick, pale scars. Those calloused hands were a permanent reminder of my early days. 40 years ago, I was not wearing custom suits or sitting in corner offices. I was physically loading freight into the back of freezing trailers at 2 a.m, breaking my back to build Harrison Logistics, one brutal delivery at a time. I had sacrificed my youth, my sleep, and my body to build an empire worth $400 million. And I did it all so my family would never have to know the bitter taste of poverty that I grew up with. My gaze drifted to the empty passenger seat. A familiar dull ache tugged at my heart. My wife had passed away 3 years ago. The grief had been a suffocating blanket that I thought I would never crawl out from under. The sprawling estate I returned to every night felt far too large and far too empty without her laughter echoing through the halls. The only constant, reliable presence in that house over the past few years had been Maria, our housekeeper. Maria had been with us for a decade. She had stood by my side during my wife's funeral, offering silent, steady support, and she managed the estate with a quiet grace that I deeply respected. She was family in every way that mattered. Traffic on the highway began to thin out as I moved further away from the city center. I was just passing the exit for Midtown when my phone buzzed violently in the cup holder. The sudden noise startled me. I glanced down, expecting to see an email from my corporate attorneys or perhaps a flight update from the airline. Instead, the screen illuminated with a text message from Maria. It was highly unusual for her to contact me directly while I was driving. She knew my schedule and always respected my privacy. I picked up the phone, keeping one eye on the road, and tapped the screen to read the notification. The words struck me like a physical blow to the chest. Mr. Harrison, do not go home. Check the security cameras now. I read the message twice, my brain struggling to process the sheer panic bleeding through those short, urgent sentences. Check the cameras now. A cold, sharp spike of adrenaline flooded my veins. My immediate thought was that someone had broken into the estate. A home invasion. Was Maria hiding in a closet? Was she hurt? My heart began to hammer wildly against my ribs, an erratic, terrifying rhythm that made the breath catch in my throat. I swerved hard into the right lane, ignoring the angry blare of a horn from a passing sedan, and took the very next exit. My hands, the same hands that had just been resting peacefully on the wheel, were now trembling uncontrollably. I gripped the steering wheel so hard, my knuckles turned a stark bone white. I needed to pull over. I needed to see what was happening inside my home. I veered into a desolate, rundown gas station just off the exit ramp. The parking lot was empty, the pavement cracked and overgrown with weeds. I slammed the transmission into park, the tires screeching slightly against the loose gravel. I killed the engine, but the roaring in my ears was deafening. My breathing came in short, shallow gasps. I fumbled frantically with my phone, my thick fingers slipping against the glass screen as I desperately tried to unlock it. I opened the Secure Estate monitoring app. The small loading circle spun on the black screen for what felt like an absolute eternity. My mind raced through a dozen horrifying scenarios. I imagined shattered glass, masked intruders, my private sanctuary violated by violent strangers. Please let Maria be safe. I prayed silently, my chest tightening painfully. Please, just let her be safe. Finally, the screen blinked, and the live feeds from the various security cameras around the property popped into view. I tapped the icon for the main driveway camera, expecting to see a strange van or police cruisers. The video feed expanded, filling my phone screen with high-definition clarity. I stared at the moving image, my mouth falling open, the breath completely vanishing from my lungs. The adrenaline that had been urging me to call the police instantly evaporated, replaced by a freezing, paralyzing confusion. It was not a burglar. It was not a violent home invasion. Right there on the live feed of my private driveway, I watched a familiar silver Porsche back slowly into my open garage. It was Derek's car. I checked the timestamp at the top of the screen to make sure I was not looking at old footage. The time was exact. It had barely been 45 minutes since I dropped my son off at the departures curb of the international airport. He was supposed to be halfway through security holding a boarding pass for London. Yet here he was, pulling into my garage in the middle of a Tuesday morning. I watched absolutely frozen in disbelief as the driver's side door opened. Derek stepped out. He had taken off his suit jacket and rolled up the sleeves of his expensive dress shirt. He moved with a rushed, frantic energy, constantly glancing over his shoulder toward the street. Then the passenger side door opened. A woman stepped out onto the pristine concrete of my garage. She was wearing dark sunglasses and a sleek trench coat. Even with the glasses, I recognized her instantly. It was Monica, my daughter-in-law. My confusion deepened into a sickening pit in my stomach. Monica was supposed to be over 600 miles away. Just 2 days ago, Derek had solemnly told me that Monica had flown down to Miami in a desperate rush because her mother had suffered a severe health emergency. I had even wired them an extra $10,000 to help cover the sudden medical expenses, expressing my deepest sympathies. Yet here she was, standing in my garage, looking perfectly healthy, moving with the same frantic, nervous energy as my son. They were not sneaking around to hide an affair. They were not slacking off from work to take a secret vacation. As I watched the tiny screen of my phone bathed in the harsh, flickering fluorescent light of that abandoned gas station, the real nightmare began to unfold. Derek walked to the trunk of his Porsche and popped it open. Monica hurried over to help him. Together, straining against the obvious weight, they hauled a massive reinforced steel lockbox out of the trunk. It looked like the kind of heavy, secure transport case used by armored bank trucks. Derek set it down on the concrete with a heavy thud, that I could almost feel through the screen. He turned back to the trunk and with his wife's help pulled out a second identical steel box. They grabbed the handles and began to carry the heavy lockboxes toward the interior door that led directly into the house. They were heading straight down the main hallway. I switched the camera feed to the interior hallway, my hands slick with cold sweat. I watched my son and his wife carry the boxes past the kitchen, past the living room, marching with silent, terrifying purpose. They stopped in front of the heavy oak doors at the end of the hall. It was my private home office, a room that housed my most sensitive corporate documents, my personal financial records, and my wall safe. A room that was strictly off-limits to everyone secured by a state-of-the-art biometric fingerprint lock. I watched closely expecting them to hit a dead end. Instead, Monica pulled a small silicone mold from her coat pocket. She pressed it against the biometric scanner. The small light above the handle flashed a solid bright green. The lock clicked open. They pushed the heavy oak doors open and dragged the steel boxes into my sanctuary. The doors swung shut behind them, leaving the hallway empty. I sat alone in my car, staring at the blank hallway feed, the cold realization washing over me like a tidal wave of ice. They had cloned my fingerprint. They had faked a trip to London. They had lied about a dying mother. All of it was a meticulously crafted illusion to get me out of the house, to ensure I was driving away on the highway while they infiltrated my most private, secure space. My own flesh and blood had just executed a tactical breach of my home, and I was about to find out exactly why. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, the harsh artificial light of the gas station, casting long shadows across my dashboard. The live feed from my home security application was crystal clear, capturing every pixel of the betrayal unfolding in my driveway. A sleek silver Porsche rolled smoothly onto the decorative paving stones, its headlights cutting through the morning shadows of the estate. It was Derek. There was no mistaking the customized license plate, nor the familiar hum of the engine I had paid for. My chest tightened so painfully that I had to force myself to breathe. It had been exactly 45 minutes since I stood on the crowded curb of the international terminal, hugging my son, wishing him luck on a transatlantic flight to London. He had looked me right in the eyes wearing that tailored Navy suit and promised to secure the logistics contract that would safeguard our empire for the next decade. I had felt such immense pride in that moment. Now, that warm pride was rapidly curdling into a toxic, freezing dread. I watched the heavy cedar garage doors automatically glide open on the video feed. The Porsche slipped inside, hiding itself away from the prying eyes of our affluent Buckhead neighborhood. My breathing grew shallow. Why was he here? Did he miss his flight? A naive part of my mind clawed for a rational explanation for why the vice president of my company, my own flesh and blood, was sneaking back into the house while I was supposed to be navigating highway traffic. But the cold logic that had helped me build Harrison Logistics from a single rented delivery truck to a nationwide fleet told me otherwise. You do not hide from your own father unless you are doing something in the shadows. The camera feed switched to the interior of the garage. The driver's side door swung open, and Derek stepped out onto the polished concrete. He had already stripped off his suit jacket and unbuttoned his crisp white collar. He moved with a frantic, twitchy energy, constantly glancing over his shoulder toward the closed garage doors as if he expected the police to be right behind him. Then the passenger side door popped open. A woman stepped out. She was wearing dark sunglasses, a beige trench coat, and carried a large designer tote bag. It was Monica, my daughter-in-law. My fingers clenched around the thin edges of my phone until my joints ached. Monica was supposed to be over 600 miles away in Florida. Just 2 days ago, Derek had sat in my living room looking absolutely devastated, explaining that Monica's mother had suffered a massive stroke. He told me she had to take an emergency red-eye flight to Miami to sit by her mother's hospital bed. I had immediately wired them $10,000 from my personal account to cover out-of-pocket medical expenses, assuring them that family always comes first. I had deeply grieved for her pain, Yet here she was, standing perfectly healthy in my garage, hundreds of miles away from any intensive care unit. There was no grief in her rigid posture. Instead, she moved with a sharp efficiency, adjusting her heavy coat and nodding silently at Derek to hurry up. The lie was so blatant, so perfectly constructed, that it literally took my breath away. They had orchestrated this entire false narrative just to ensure my house would be completely empty. I watched closely as Derek hurried to the front of the Porsche and popped the hood open. Monica stepped up right beside him, setting her bag on the ground. Together they reached inside the storage compartment and hauled out a massive, reinforced steel lockbox. I could see the immense physical strain on Derek's face as he lifted his side of the box, the veins bulging visibly in his neck. They set it down on the concrete floor with a heavy thud that I could almost feel vibrating through the speaker of my phone. Derek immediately reached back into the trunk and hauled out a second identical steel box. What in the world was inside those containers? Why were they so incredibly heavy? And why were my son and his wife sneaking them into my home like common thieves? I toggled the security application, switching the feed to the main interior hallway of the estate. The camera captured them entering the house through the back mudroom. They walked shoulder to shoulder, carrying the heavy steel boxes between them, their footsteps echoing slightly on the hardwood floors. They marched right past the kitchen. They walked right past the formal dining room, where we had shared a loving family Thanksgiving dinner just a few months ago. They did not hesitate or slow their pace for a single second. They moved with a practiced military precision, heading straight down the long corridor toward the isolated north wing of the estate. They were heading straight for my private home office. It is the absolute nerve center of Harrison Logistics. It houses decades of proprietary supply chain algorithms, deeply confidential client contracts, and the master financial ledgers representing my entire life's work. Because of the extreme sensitivity of those corporate documents, I had installed heavy solid oak doors secured by a state-of-the-art military-grade biometric fingerprint scanner. Only my unique fingerprint could open that highly advanced lock. Nobody else had access. Not my executive management team, not my trusted housekeeper, and certainly not my ambitious son. I watched the black and white hallway feed as Derek and Monica stopped directly in front of those imposing oak doors. I waited for them to drop the heavy boxes and turn around in complete frustration. Instead, Monica calmly let go of the steel handle of the lockbox and reached deep into the pocket of her beige trench coat. She pulled out a small, translucent silicone mold. My heart stopped beating. She stepped up to the digital keypad on the wall, carefully aligned the fabricated silicone mold over her own right thumb, and pressed it firmly against the glowing glass scanner. The security system beeped once, a sharp, piercing sound that registered clearly on the camera's audio feed. The tiny LED light positioned above the heavy brass handle shifted from a solid red to a bright, welcoming green. The locking mechanism clicked loudly, the sound echoing ominously in the empty hallway. Derek grabbed the brass handle, pushed the heavy oak doors open with his shoulder, and together they dragged those massive steel lockboxes straight into my private sanctuary. The doors swung shut behind them, leaving the hallway completely empty and silent. I sat frozen in the driver's seat of my car, staring blankly at the inactive feed on my phone screen. My own flesh and blood had not just lied to me. They had secretly mapped my security protocols. They had stolen and cloned my biometric fingerprint. They had executed a flawless breach of my home with terrifying efficiency. And I knew with the chilling certainty of a man who had survived decades of ruthless corporate warfare that whatever was inside those heavy steel boxes was meant to entirely destroy me. I sat in the suffocating silence of my vehicle, the harsh neon lights of the gas station canopy buzzing faintly through the glass. The live camera feed on my mobile phone had gone dark. My chest ached with a heavy, crushing weight that made it difficult to draw a full breath. I needed to understand the exact scope of what I was dealing with. In the brutal world of corporate logistics, when you suspect a competitor is moving against you, you test their narrative to see how well it holds together under pressure. I connected my phone to the hands-free audio system and scrolled through my contacts until I found Derek. My finger hovered over his name for an agonizing moment. Part of me was terrified of what I was about to hear. I pressed the call button. The line rang 3 times. On the 4th ring, the line clicked open. "Dad," "Hey," Derek answered. His voice was breathless, projecting a manufactured urgency that I recognized immediately. I had heard him use that exact tone 100 times when smoothing over delayed shipments with impatient corporate clients. I forced my own voice to remain calm, steady, projecting the innocent warmth of a proud father. "Hey, son," I said, keeping my words measured. "I wanted to call and make sure you got through the security checkpoints without any trouble. The airport was a madhouse when I dropped you off today." "Oh yeah, it was a nightmare," Derek replied, his tone dripping with fake exasperation. The lines at the international terminal were wrapped all the way around the ticketing counters, but I used my priority status and breezed right through the process. I am actually standing near the departure gate right now. They just made the first boarding announcement for the upper-class cabin. I closed my eyes, picturing him standing in my hallway. I could hear a faint, hollow echo in the background of his audio, the distinct acoustic bounce of my own marble foyer, not the muffled roar of a crowded airport terminal. "Is that right?" I asked, tightening my grip on the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. "Well, that is absolutely fantastic. You have a safe flight, Derek." "Thanks, Dad," he said. "Listen, I really have to go. The gate agent is calling my boarding group right now. I will call you the second the wheels touch the runway at Heathrow." "I love you, Dad." "I love you too, son," I replied. I ended the phone call. The silence in the car rushed back in feeling heavier and colder than before. He had lied without a single hesitation. The deception was flawless, practiced, and delivered with terrifying ease. My own son, the man I had groomed to take over an empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars, had just spun a complete fabrication without a trace of guilt. He had sounded so convincing. A deep, unsettling nausea began to twist in the pit of my stomach. This was definitely not a crime of opportunity. This was a carefully premeditated operation. Derek could not have orchestrated this breach alone. He needed his partner. I took a breath to steady my hands and selected Monica from my contacts. The line began to ring softly through the car speakers. I waited patiently, preparing my mind for whatever dramatic performance she had queued up for me. She answered on the 3rd ring. "Hello," she answered. Her voice was hushed, raspy, actively conveying a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. "Robert, hi. I'm sorry I missed your call today." I bit the inside of my cheek to maintain my composure. "Monica, sweetheart," I said, projecting deep paternal concern. "I was just checking in on you. Derek told me how terrible things were looking right now. How is your mother doing? Are you at the hospital in Miami right now?" There was a brief, highly calculated pause on the other end of the line. "I am sitting right next to her hospital bed, Robert," she whispered softly. "The doctors say it was a very severe stroke. She is stabilized for now, but it is just so incredibly hard seeing her like this." I listened closely to the background audio quality of the call. Beneath her hushed voice, I could distinctly hear a faint rhythmic beeping sound. It was the steady mechanical ping of a heart monitor, followed immediately by the artificial whoosh of a medical ventilator. The audio quality was slightly tinny and compressed. It was a pre-recorded sound effect. She was standing directly inside my home office, holding her mobile phone in one hand and actively playing hospital sounds from a video on her tablet with the other. My blood turned to absolute ice in my veins. The sheer sociopathic perfection of her lie was utterly staggering to witness. "That is awful, Monica," I murmured, forcing a deeply sympathetic sigh into the receiver. "I cannot even begin to imagine how exhausted you must be feeling. Have you been able to get any sleep at all?" "Barely," she replied, adding a subtle trembling sniffle to her flawless performance. "I have been awake for 36 hours straight. I absolutely refuse to leave her room. The $10,000 you wired us was an absolute lifesaver, Robert." It fully covered the emergency airlift medical transfer. Thank you so much for always being there for us. You are so incredibly generous. The audacity of her words felt like a physical strike directly against my jaw. She was openly thanking me for the money I had sent. In good faith money she had pocketed to fund this very betrayal. Of course you are, sweetheart, I said, my voice now dangerously calm. You are family. You just focus entirely on your mother. Do not worry about anything else right now. Get some rest, if you possibly can. Thank you, Robert, she whispered back. You are truly the best father-in-law a girl could ever ask for. Bye. The digital phone line went completely dead. I dropped my phone onto the passenger seat. I stared out the windshield, my mind spinning violently as the horrifying magnitude of this conspiracy settled over me. Their flawless lies sickened me. This was not a careless mistake. This was a brilliantly executed deception. They faked an international trip to get me out. They fabricated a devastating medical emergency to explain Monica's absence and extract $10,000 from my accounts. They bypassed a biometric scanner with a mold. They did all of this not to steal money out of my wall safe, but to secretly place heavy steel boxes inside of it. The question echoed in the vehicle. Why would my son and daughter-in-law fake an international trip and a medical emergency just to sneak mysterious lockboxes into my personal safe? In the ruthless world of corporate logistics, you learn that when someone breaks into your sanctuary to leave something behind, they are not looking to rob you. They are looking to frame you. Whatever they were hiding in that steel vault, it was designed to ensure that all damning evidence pointed directly to me. Suddenly, the high-definition feed from the inside hallway went completely black. A fraction of a second later, the lens looking inside my private home office flickered with violent lines of white noise before dissolving into a flat, dead grid of gray static. I stared at the dark screen of my phone, my thumb hovering over the refresh icon, but I knew pressing it would be entirely useless. They had jammed the frequency. They had brought a localized digital signal blocker into my house to isolate that room from the external network. It was a clean tactical move, the kind of counter-surveillance operation a high-level corporate competitor would deploy to block a target from seeing a hostile takeover unfold. But as I sat there, in the quiet cabin of my vehicle, surrounded by the rotting smell of old oil and cheap fuel from that gas station lot, the initial shock faded, replaced by something much more dangerous. The primal predatory intuition of a ruthless businessman kicked in. You do not survive 40 years in the cutthroat shark tank of the transportation and supply chain industry by panicking when your primary network goes down. You survive by looking for the hidden patterns behind the unexpected glitch. My mind immediately flashed back to an incident that occurred exactly 1 month ago. It was a rainy Thursday evening, and the primary security system had triggered a localized alarm zone near the lower terrace windows. When the private security guards arrived, they found a basement window partially unlatched, but absolutely nothing had been stolen from the property. The police had dismissed it as a random amateur vagrant attempting a quick, opportunistic theft before getting spooked by the sirens. At the time, I had accepted that easy explanation, too exhausted from managing a massive union labor dispute at our main shipping terminal to dig any deeper into the matter. But looking at the dead static on my phone screen right now, the veil of ignorance was ripped away. It had not been a random burglar. It had been Monica. My daughter-in-law had orchestrated that entire false alarm just to map my security blind spots. She wanted to test the response times of the local precinct and identify the exact layout of the house wiring. The conflict inside me heightened as I watched the blank screen. This was not an impulsive mistake. This was a highly calculated corporate espionage project carried out by my own family. The realization hit me with the force of a physical strike. They had spent weeks studying my routine, tracking my movements, and isolating my patterns. They had treated my private residence like a target fortress that needed to be systematically dismantled from the inside out. They had been planning this exact infiltration for months, waiting for the perfect window of opportunity while I was completely consumed by grief burying my late wife and struggling to keep our $400 million logistics enterprise afloat. A sickening clarity began to settle over my thoughts as I connected this physical security mapping to Derek's bizarre behavior over the past few months. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, revealing a deeply ruthless strategy. It started with subtle passing remarks during our weekly executive committee briefings. Derek would look at me with a soft, manufactured look of deep concern in his eyes and say things like, "Dad, you already reviewed that container manifest. Yesterday, are you sure you are feeling okay?" Or he would casually mention to the board of directors that I had misplaced my car keys or forgotten the exact date of a major client dinner. He was deliberately creating a quiet, insidious narrative that the founder of the company was finally losing his edge. It was a calculated campaign of psychological manipulation designed to make the shareholders doubt my capability. They were gaslighting me, trying to make me doubt my own sanity, carefully building a paper trail of mental decline. And it all culminated last week in my private office right before Derek announced this fraudulent international contract trip. He had walked into my office carrying a thick leather-bound folder prepared by an outside legal firm. He had set it on my mahogany desk, leaning over my shoulder with an aggressive, suffocating closeness that made me feel trapped. He told me it was a sweeping medical power of attorney document. He had looked at me with that perfect, practiced smile and said, "Dad, your blood pressure has been dangerously high since Mom passed, and if your heart suddenly acts up while I am out of the country, the banking institutions will freeze our logistics assets." He argued that I needed to sign total legal authority over to him immediately just to protect the family name and ensure the absolute continuity of the firm. I had hesitated that day, thank God. Something deep in my gut had recoiled at the sheer scope of the legal authority that document demanded, and I told him I wanted my personal attorney to review the clauses first. Derek had grown visibly defensive, his eyes flashing with a brief, ugly spark of anger, before he quickly masked it with another layer of filial concern. Now, sitting in the absolute silence of my car, the true horror of their trap exposed itself. They did not just want to steal from my wall safe. They were actively setting me up to face criminal charges. They needed that signed medical power of attorney so that the moment the federal authorities discovered whatever illegal cargo was inside those heavy steel lockboxes, Derek could step forward as the sole legal guardian of my person and my assets. He would declare me mentally incompetent to face a federal grand jury, locking me away in a secure psychiatric facility or a secluded prison hospital, while he and Monica quietly liquidated my life work to fund his massive gambling debts. They were treating my 70-year-old body like an expired asset that needed to be discarded for cash. But my son had made one fatal error. He had assumed that because I was 70, I was weak. He had assumed that because I was grieving the loss of his mother, I was completely blind to his greed. He had forgotten that I built this empire by outsmarting cutthroat competitors far more dangerous than him. I reached into the console compartment and pulled out an encrypted security key fob. Derek and Monica believed they had entirely blinded me by jamming the house wireless router, but they had absolutely no concept of old-school hardwired infrastructure. When I remodeled the estate 5 years ago, I secretly ran an analog coaxial cable directly through the concrete foundation walls, completely bypassing the digital network. I hid an analog pinhole camera inside a vintage bronze hunting trophy, resting on my top bookshelf. I flipped the physical override switch, logged into the secure analog server, and watched the crisp video stream pop onto my screen. My jaw locked as I saw them standing in my private office, completely oblivious that the old man was actively watching their every single move inside his private sanctuary. The analog video feed was breathtakingly clear, completely immune to the digital jamming device they had plugged into my hallway outlet. Through the hidden lens concealed perfectly inside the eye of the bronze hunting trophy, I had an unobstructed elevated view of my entire office. The microphone picked up their shallow breathing and the faint rustle of their clothing in the quiet room. They moved directly toward the far wall, completely ignoring the expensive artwork the antique clocks, and the display cases holding my most valuable collectibles. They went straight for the solid mahogany panels that concealed my primary wall safe. Derek stood back, glancing nervously at the closed office doors, while Monica stepped right up to the wood paneling. She pushed the hidden release latch, swinging the heavy wooden cover open to reveal the thick steel face of the safe. I had purchased that specific vault precisely because it possessed a mechanical override dial alongside the digital keypad, ensuring I would never be locked out during a prolonged power failure. Monica did not even bother looking at the digital keypad. She reached into her beige coat and pulled out a sleek professional lockpicking kit. My stomach dropped as I watched my daughter-in-law, a woman who hosted high society charity galas and arranged floral centerpieces for a living, manipulate a set of tension wrenches with the practiced, chilling grace of a seasoned professional. She pressed her ear against the cold steel of the safe, slowly turning the heavy mechanical dial. 1 click. 2 clicks. I could hear the faint metallic tumblers falling perfectly into place through the high-definition audio feed. She had clearly been practicing this exact technique for months, preparing for this very moment. With a final satisfying click, she pulled the heavy handle downward. The massive door of my supposedly impenetrable vault swung wide open, exposing the neatly stacked bundles of cash, family heirlooms, and sensitive corporate documents I kept inside. They completely ignored the stacks of $100 bills. They did not touch my late wife's diamond necklaces or the velvet boxes holding her vintage watches. My initial lingering assumption that they were simply greedy children looking to rob their wealthy father evaporated instantly. They were not here to steal my wealth. They were here to deliver something far more dangerous. Derek dragged the first reinforced steel lockbox across the carpet and positioned it directly in front of the open safe. He unlatched the heavy clasps and threw open the lid. Inside, resting in dense foam cutouts, were rows of sleek metallic flash drives. Cold wallets. I recognized them from various cybersecurity briefings my logistics firm had conducted last year. These were untraceable offline storage devices used to hold massive amounts of cryptocurrency far away from the prying eyes of the federal banking system. Derek began grabbing the cold wallets by the handful, frantically shoving them into the empty spaces on the bottom shelf of my safe. He packed them tightly alongside my legitimate investment portfolios and estate planning documents. Once the first box was emptied of crypto drives, he kicked it aside and immediately opened the second container. This one was entirely filled with thick, bound stacks of legal paper. These were heavily redacted corporate contracts, wire transfer authorizations, and complex international shipping manifests. Derek grabbed the thick stacks of paper and shoved them onto the middle shelf of my safe directly on top of the original blueprints for Harrison Logistics. He was breathing heavily, sweat beading on his forehead as he worked with a frantic, terrified urgency. He was treating my private vault like a dumping ground for highly toxic waste. I watched him shove the last bundle of documents into the safe, his hands visibly shaking under the intense pressure of whatever illicit operation he was running. I pinched my mobile phone screen, utilizing the optical zoom capability of the hidden analog camera to focus tightly on the papers Derek was haphazardly shoving onto the shelf. The resolution held perfectly, allowing me to read the bold, capitalized headers printed across the crisp white pages. My blood turned to ice as I processed the words. These were not legitimate supply chain agreements or standard vendor contracts. They were complex, multi-layered offshore holding agreements. I saw the names of international shell companies registered in notorious tax havens. I saw massive wire transfer routing numbers connected to foreign banking institutions that Harrison Logistics absolutely never did business with. But the most horrifying detail was not the offshore account numbers or the sheer volume of the illicit transactions. It was the bottom of the visible page. I zoomed in as close as the camera software would possibly allow. There, resting on the signature line of a contract authorizing the transfer of millions of untraceable dollars, was my name, Richard Harrison. And right above it was my exact, unmistakable signature. The bold, sweeping curves of the letters, the distinct angle of the crossing lines, the precise pressure points of the ink. It was a flawless, masterful forgery. My own son had perfectly replicated my signature to bind me legally to these fraudulent documents. He had forged my identity on dozens, perhaps hundreds of contracts, effectively tying my life, my reputation, and my corporate empire to a vast, invisible network of illegal wealth. I stared at my stolen signature on the screen, a profound, sickening wave of betrayal washing over me. This was not just a case of corporate embezzlement or a desperate son skimming profits off the top of my company ledgers to support a lavish lifestyle. This was a full-scale, highly sophisticated money laundering operation. The massive stacks of contracts, hidden offshore shell companies, and untraceable cryptocurrency cold wallets painted a terrifying, undeniable picture. My son was washing dirty money for a criminal organization. He moved millions of illicit dollars through the clean, highly respected supply chain channels of Harrison Logistics. He was laundering money for violent cartels utilizing the pristine reputation I had spent 40 years building to mask their illegal transactions. And he was structuring the entire criminal enterprise directly in my name. By planting forged documents and crypto drives inside my personal wall safe behind a biometric lock only I could open, he ensured I would take the full force of the inevitable fall. He was turning my secure sanctuary into ground zero of a federal crime scene. My chest tightened with an intense, suffocating pressure. A week ago, I might have mistakenly believed this physical sensation was the fatal heart condition Derek was always so deeply concerned about. I might have reached for my medication and called an ambulance. But sitting there in the cold, dim light of my vehicle, I knew exactly what this feeling was. It was not age, it was not illness, it was pure cold rage, a fierce protective fire ignited in my veins, burning away every lingering trace of shock and parental grief. My son believed he could sacrifice my life to cover his colossal failures. He believed I was just a clueless old man waiting quietly for the end. But he had fundamentally misunderstood the very nature of the man who raised him. Through the tinny speaker of my mobile phone, the muffled sounds of my home office filtered into my vehicle. I heard the heavy metallic scrape of the solid steel safe door closing, followed by the definitive spin of the mechanical dial. Monica was locking the vault, sealing my forged signature, and the illicit cryptocurrency drives in total darkness. I held the phone closer to my ear, straining to catch every nuance. The hidden analog microphone was highly sensitive, designed to pick up even the faintest whispers. Monica stood up, dusting off her beige trench coat, with a look of absolute disgust. She turned to my son, a cruel, mocking smile spreading across her lips. "The old fool will not know what hit him until the feds kick the door down," she said. Her voice was devoid of hesitation or remorse. It was crisp, casual, and incredibly cold. She spoke about my impending destruction, with the same mild annoyance she usually reserved for a delayed dinner reservation. I braced myself, waiting for Derek to interject, waiting for some small fragment of the boy I had raised to surface and object to her venomous words. Instead, a low, genuine chuckle rumbled from my son's chest. It was a relaxed, victorious laugh. Once the FBI arrests him for money laundering, the stress will trigger his heart condition, Derek said, his tone conversational and terrifying. He leaned against the edge of my mahogany desk, crossing his arms over his chest. The medical power of attorney kicks in instantly. I liquidate his shares, pay off the Macau casino debt, and let him rot in federal lockup. He is 70 anyway, his time is up. I sat in the driver's seat, the engine still turned off, the thick night air pressing against the windows. I did not gasp. I did not shed a single tear. The deep, agonizing grief that had been suffocating me since I first saw them pull into my driveway evaporated in a defining instant. It was incinerated by a freezing, calculating wrath. That specific phrase echoed in the confined space of my vehicle. Let him rot in federal lockup. He is 70 anyway, his time is up. In that profound moment of silence, a fundamental transformation occurred deep within my soul. The indulgent patriarch who spent 38 years making excuses for his son simply ceased to exist. That father died in the front seat of an SUV, murdered by his own flesh and blood. In his place, the corporate shark awakened. The ruthless, uncompromising architect who had built a $400 million logistics empire from nothing finally opened his eyes. My mind dissected Derek's confession with surgical precision. The Macau casino debt. It was the missing puzzle piece illuminating the entire conspiracy. My son was not just greedy, he was desperate. He had leveraged his lifestyle to gamble in offshore syndicates, accumulating catastrophic debt to dangerous triads. He was trapped in a financial corner of his own making, facing violent creditors. Rather than coming to me like a man confessing his failures and asking for my help, he had chosen the path of a coward. He decided to serve his own father to the federal government to save his skin. He needed that medical power of attorney to bypass the board of directors and unilaterally liquidate my shares. He needed the FBI to raid my home and find those planted documents to immediately trigger competency clauses. He had orchestrated sophisticated character assassination, gaslighting me for months to establish a documented history of mental decline. It was a flawlessly designed corporate coup. I checked the video feed again. Monica was carefully packing away her professional lockpicking tools, slipping the sleek leather case back into her designer tote bag. She looked around the pristine office, completely indifferent to the lives she was attempting to destroy. Derek grabbed the 2 empty steel lockboxes, his posture relaxed, the heavy burden of his gambling debt seemingly lifted by the prospect of my imminent imprisonment. They walked toward the heavy oak doors, absolutely confident that their infiltration had been a total, undetected success. I watched them leave my sanctuary. The doors swung shut behind them, leaving the analog feed showing only the quiet, empty expanse of my office. The sheer arrogance of their plan was staggering yet incredibly fragile. They built their entire criminal strategy on the absolute certainty that I was blind, trusting, and slow. They believed the game was already over. But in the high-stakes arena of corporate warfare, assuming your opponent is neutralized before the final contract is signed is a fatal miscalculation. Derek and Monica had spent months carefully stacking dry kindling around my life, waiting for the federal authorities to strike the match. What they did not realize was that I was now holding the flamethrower. I closed the hidden camera application on my mobile phone, leaving the screen completely dark. My breathing was steady, measured, and perfectly controlled. The physical symptoms of panic, the racing heart, the trembling hands, the shallow breaths were entirely gone. My nervous system recalibrated, shifting from the defensive posture of a betrayed parent to the offensive stance of an apex predator. I reached for the keys in the ignition and turned them. The powerful engine roared to life, a resonant growl cutting through the silence of the desolate gas station. I turned on the headlights, illuminating the cracked pavement. I had a very limited window of opportunity to act before the morning sun brought the full force of the federal government down upon my estate. Derek was correct about one thing. An arrest by the FBI coupled with a federal money laundering indictment would completely destroy me. The ensuing scandal would tank the stock value of Harrison Logistics, panic our international shareholders, and force the board to suspend my executive authority. Even if I eventually proved my innocence in court, the process would take years, leaving my legacy in absolute ruins. I could not simply wait for the authorities to arrive and attempt to explain my way out of forged evidence. I needed to intercept the narrative. I needed to fundamentally alter the digital landscape of the trap they had set. My son wanted to play a high-level game of financial subterfuge and legal manipulation. It was time to show him exactly who had written the rules of that game. I pulled my vehicle out of the parking lot, merging onto the dark, empty stretch of the interstate. My mind was clear, cataloging resources, evaluating liabilities, and formulating a rapid, devastating counteroffensive. I did not drive back toward my sprawling estate in Buckhead. Returning home now, while Derek and Monica were still occupying the property, would severely compromise my tactical advantage. I needed a secure location, where I could assemble a war council without raising suspicions. I reached over to the passenger seat, picking up my phone once again. I bypassed my executive management team, my public relations directors, and my standard corporate counsel. This situation required a completely different breed of professional. I selected the name of the most ruthless legal mind I had ever employed. It was time to work. I kept the engine at a steady hum as I navigated the empty stretches of the interstate, leaving the affluent streets of Buckhead far behind. The glowing dashboard clock read 9:30. I bypassed the high-end steakhouses where Derek usually conducted his covert negotiations. I needed a location completely disconnected from the pristine corporate world of Harrison Logistics. I drove toward the industrial outskirts of Atlanta, a rough blue-collar district dominated by freight yards and diesel mechanics. I pulled into the cracked parking lot of a 24-hour diner. It was a gritty, unforgiving place illuminated by flickering fluorescent lights. The air smelled heavily of exhaust fumes. This was the exact type of establishment where I had eaten my meals 40 years ago, back when I drove my own delivery trucks and fought for every single dollar. It was the perfect environment to assemble my war council. I parked my vehicle in the darkest corner of the lot, ensuring my license plate was obscured by the shadows of a towering dumpster. I picked up my mobile phone and pressed the call button for Jonathan Pierce. Jonathan was not the smiling general counsel who handled public relations or drafted polite memos. He was a ruthless, brilliant corporate defense attorney. He specialized in aggressive litigation, hostile takeovers, and dismantling federal investigations before they saw a courtroom. He thrived in the darkest, most vicious corners of the legal system. The line rang twice before he answered. His voice was sharp, alert, and ready for conflict. "Richard," he said, his tone devoid of pleasantries. "You do not call my direct line unless a building is burning down or a federal agency is asking questions." "Jonathan," I replied, my voice perfectly level. "I need you down at the old rail yard diner on Industrial Boulevard. Drop whatever you are doing and come alone. Do not speak to your associates. Do not email your paralegals, and do not log into the corporate network. We have a massive, immediate crisis." He did not ask for details or complain about the commute. "I will be there in 20 minutes, he stated flatly. The line disconnected. I stepped out of my vehicle and walked through the heavy glass doors of the diner. The interior was nearly empty, occupied only by a few exhausted long-haul truck drivers and a waitress wiping down a sticky Formica counter. I chose a booth in the far back corner, positioned so I had a clear line of sight to the main entrance, while my back remained safely against the wall. I ordered a black coffee, letting the bitter, scalding liquid ground my senses. Every passing second felt heavy, laden with the profound weight of my familial betrayal. I replayed the audio of Derek laughing about my death, using it to fuel the cold, mechanical engine of my focus. I could not afford grief. Grief was a luxury for peacetime. Exactly 18 minutes later, the diner door swung open. Jonathan Pierce stepped inside. He wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit that looked out of place amidst the vinyl booths and cracked linoleum tiles. His eyes scanned the room with practiced efficiency before locking onto my position. He slid into the booth across from me, his expression grave and analytical. He set a thick leather briefcase onto the table but did not open it. "Give it to me, Richard," he said quietly. "What exactly are we dealing with tonight?" I did not waste time with introductory explanations. I placed my mobile phone face up on the table between us and pressed play. Jonathan leaned forward, his sharp eyes narrowing as the hidden analog camera footage filled the small screen. I watched his face closely as he observed Monica expertly picking the physical lock of my primary wall safe. I watched his jaw tighten as Derek hauled the heavy steel containers into the frame, violently shoving untraceable cryptocurrency cold wallets and thick stacks of forged offshore contracts onto my shelves. The audio played clearly, broadcasting their terrifying dialogue into the quiet booth. Jonathan listened to every single word. He listened to my son laugh about my impending federal arrest and my deteriorating heart condition. When the video finally ended, and the screen went dark, Jonathan slowly leaned back against the vinyl seat. He did not express shock or offer meaningless sympathies. His mind was already calculating the legal velocity of the threat. "Richard," he began, his voice dropping to a harsh, serious whisper. "This is a highly sophisticated framing operation. They are using your clean logistics network to wash millions of cartel dollars, and they have meticulously forged the paper trail to end directly at your desk. But that is not even the most urgent problem we have right now." I stared at him, my posture rigid. What could possibly be more urgent than my own son operating a money laundering syndicate out of my home office, I asked. Jonathan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an encrypted mobile device. "Just 2 hours ago, I received an automatic alert from a contact I maintain inside the Federal Financial Crimes Database," he explained. "An anonymous tip was flagged in the federal system. The tip was incredibly detailed, providing specific offshore routing numbers, exact cryptographic wallet addresses, and the precise physical location of the evidence." I felt a cold chill wash over my skin. "Monica," I said, recognizing her calculating efficiency. She planted the evidence and immediately initiated the anonymous tip to ensure the trap snapped shut. "Yes," Jonathan confirmed grimly. "She handed you to the wolves on a silver platter. The FBI and the IRS have established a joint task force. They are currently fast-tracking a federal search warrant based on that anonymous tip. They are coordinating a massive dawn raid on your estate. They will be kicking your front doors down at exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." I looked at the diner wall clock. It was slightly past 6 o'clock in the evening. I had less than 14 hours to dismantle a federal trap that took my son and his wife months to carefully build. 14 hours before federal agents stormed my property, seized my assets, and handcuffed me in front of national television cameras. If I allowed that to happen, Harrison Logistics would plummet into bankruptcy, and my legacy would be erased by a devastating federal indictment. I looked across the table at my defense attorney, the cold fury radiating from my chest. "I will not allow my life to be dismantled by a spoiled child," I stated, my voice echoing with absolute authority. Jonathan slowly nodded, matching my intense, predatory gaze. "We need to move the evidence, burn the offshore digital trail, and completely redirect the blast radius back onto Derek before the sun rises over Atlanta," he replied, sliding his thick leather briefcase closer. I picked up my black coffee, taking a long, deliberate sip. "We are not just going to redirect the blast radius, Jonathan," I said smoothly. "We are going to ensure that my son and his wife take the full, unrelenting impact of the federal government. Let us get to work." Jonathan did not open his leather briefcase immediately. Instead, he folded his hands on the sticky Formica table and looked at me with a gaze as sharp as shattered glass. "You cannot simply go back to the house and remove those steel lockboxes, Richard." He stated, his voice a low, authoritative rumble that barely carried over the hum of the diner refrigerator. "If you remove the physical evidence now, you will trigger the secondary trap your son has undoubtedly set. The federal authorities do not execute a dawn raid on a prominent corporate executive based on a single anonymous tip without having preliminary surveillance in place. There are likely unmarked vehicles parked at the perimeter of your estate right now, monitoring the gates with thermal imaging. If you are caught sneaking out of your own property in the dead of night, carrying heavy lockboxes filled with illicit cartel contracts, you hand them the exact visual confirmation of guilt they desperately need. Moving the evidence is the behavior of a guilty man attempting to destroy a paper trail. We must leave the physical containers exactly where Derek planted them inside your safe." I frowned, the bitter taste of black coffee lingering on my tongue. "If I leave the evidence inside my vault, the agents will seize it at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning," I countered, keeping my tone perfectly measured. "They will find my forged signature on those documents, and they will find the cryptocurrency drives. How does leaving the poison in my house save my life?" Jonathan finally smiled, a cold, predatory expression that reminded me why I paid him thousands of dollars an hour. The physical location of the evidence does not matter if the digital infrastructure of that evidence points in the opposite direction, he explained. We do not need to move the metal boxes. We need to digitally alter their contents. We need to rewrite the digital signatures encoded on those flash drives and fabricate a secondary layer of financial routing that bypasses your identity entirely. Derek was careless. He assumed physical proximity equaled legal culpability. He forgot that in the modern era of offshore money laundering, the digital footprint is the only truth that a federal auditor will ultimately believe. To execute a digital rewrite of that magnitude, we need a specialist, I said, leaning forward in the booth. My internal corporate security team is excellent, but they operate within the strict boundaries of the law. I cannot involve legitimate employees in a counter-espionage operation. Jonathan nodded, already reaching for his encrypted mobile device. I do not use legitimate corporate employees for a task like this, Richard, he replied softly. I use ghosts. He dialed a sequence of numbers, spoke 3 brief sentences in a language I did not recognize, and ended the call. He is 5 minutes away, Jonathan said, resting the phone on the table. Who is he? I asked. His name is Elias. Jonathan answered. He is a black market forensic accountant. He spent 15 years tracking illicit cartel funds for the federal government before deciding he preferred to work on the other side of the legal spectrum. There is no cryptographic firewall he cannot bypass, and there is no financial ledger he cannot completely rewrite. If your son used standard cold wallets to store his illegal cartel commissions, Elias can reverse engineer the ownership logs before the sun comes up. We waited in the dim light of the diner. Exactly 5 minutes later, the glass doors swung open. A thin, unassuming man wearing a faded gray hooded sweatshirt and wire-rimmed glasses walked into the establishment. He carried a battered canvas messenger bag slung over his narrow shoulder. He looked like an exhausted graduate student, completely invisible and utterly unremarkable. That was his greatest asset. He slid into the booth beside Jonathan, offering me a brief, silent nod. Without speaking a single word of introduction, Elias unzipped his canvas bag and pulled out a heavy military-grade laptop. He connected a series of specialized diagnostic cables to his machine, linking it to the secure hotspot generated by Jonathan's encrypted device. I need the remote access credentials to your internal home network, Elias said, his voice quiet and heavily rasped as if he rarely spoke aloud. I provided him with the hidden backdoor administrative passwords I had established when I originally built the estate. His fingers began to fly across the keyboard with a terrifying mechanical speed. Lines of complex green code cascaded down his black screen, reflecting softly against his glasses. You have a physical pinhole camera running on an isolated analog circuit. Elias observed, his eyes never leaving his monitor. I am routing my connection through that specific hardware. I can access the local wireless network Derek used when he initiated the transfers onto those cold wallets. Your son made a critical operational error. He connected his burner laptop to your home network for exactly 3 minutes to verify the cryptographic keys before locking them in your safe. That tiny digital handshake left a residual trace in your router cache. Elias tapped a final key, and a dense spreadsheet of alphanumeric codes populated his screen. These are the wallet addresses, he confirmed. Derek transferred roughly $12 million in untraceable cartel funds onto those drives. The digital ledger currently assigns ownership to an offshore shell company registered in your name, Richard. It is a very clean, very professional frame job. The federal agents will find this cache, trace the registration to you, and arrest you on the spot. I stared at the cascading numbers, the sheer scale of my son's treachery laid bare in digital ink. Can you change the ownership registry? I asked, my voice deadly calm. Elias pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose. I cannot delete the funds, he explained, his tone entirely detached and analytical. Blockchain ledgers are immutable. If I attempt to erase the money, the system will flag the transaction and alert the original senders. The cartel will know the money is missing, and the FBI will still find the physical drives in your safe. However, I do not need to erase the money. I just need to alter the routing metadata. I can inject a malicious script into the local network cache. When the Federal Cyber Division inevitably plugs those drives into their evidence-analyzing software. Tomorrow morning, my script will execute. It will automatically rewrite the digital history of the wallets, overwriting your forged credentials with a new set of primary routing instructions. I looked at Jonathan, who was watching Elias with silent approval. Where exactly are we routing the digital history? I asked. Jonathan leaned forward, his shark-like smile returning. We are routing the history directly to the source of Derek's desperation, he said smoothly. We are going to permanently link those massive cartel funds to Derek and Monica's hidden offshore casino accounts in Macau. When the federal agents follow the money trail tomorrow morning, they will definitively find a greedy, gambling-addicted son who stole from incredibly dangerous cartels. The massive federal trap he carefully built for me will instantly become his own inescapable digital prison forever. Night fell over the industrial outskirts of Atlanta, casting deep shadows across the cracked pavement of the diner parking lot. Inside the quiet booth, I monitored the hidden analog camera feed on my encrypted mobile device. The heavy oak doors of my office remained shut. Then the surveillance feed shifted to the main hallway. I watched Derek and Monica walking toward the front entrance. They were dressed for an elegant evening out. Derek wore a tailored tuxedo, and Monica was draped in a shimmering evening gown. They were laughing warmly, pouring vintage champagne from the crystal hallway bar cart directly. I watched my son raise his expensive glass, toasting to a future built entirely upon my deliberate destruction. They discussed their dinner reservations at a highly exclusive Michelin star restaurant downtown. They openly planned to celebrate their impending victory with a $1,000 tasting menu. The sheer arrogance of their celebration disgusted me profoundly, but it also provided the exact tactical opening we desperately needed today. I tracked their movements through the exterior security cameras until their silver Porsche rolled out of my driveway and vanished into the darkness of the affluent Buckhead streets. The trap was completely clear now. The moment their vehicle disappeared from the surveillance perimeter, I turned to Jonathan and Elias. The time for waiting was completely over. Elias packed his heavy military-grade laptop and the diagnostic cables back into his battered canvas messenger bag. I left a crisp $100 bill on the sticky formica table of the diner, and we walked out into the humid Georgia night. My vehicle was a silent, powerful shadow gliding smoothly through the sparse evening traffic. The drive back toward my sprawling estate was incredibly tense and completely silent. We were preparing for our absolute corporate warfare tonight. I did not pull the vehicle into my main driveway. Doing so would inevitably risk triggering the motion sensors on the front gates, potentially alerting whatever federal agents might already be monitoring the perimeter of my property. Instead, I navigated carefully through the winding tree-lined service roads that ran directly behind the massive estate. These secluded avenues were exclusively used by landscapers and private domestic staff. I parked the car beneath the thick concealing canopy of ancient weeping willows, completely obscuring the vehicle from both the public street and the main house. We all moved with urgent precision then. We moved swiftly through the damp night grass, stepping carefully over the manicured hedges and avoiding the bright decorative landscape lighting. The massive silhouette of my mansion loomed ahead, standing dark and imposing against the cloudy night sky. The primary security system was still fully armed, displaying a glowing red circle of digital defense protecting the perimeter. But a formidable fortress is only as secure as the loyalty of the people actively operating it. And while my own son had brutally betrayed me, the dedicated people who actually managed my daily life remained fiercely and unquestionably loyal to me entirely. Earlier that evening, I had sent a brief, highly encrypted text message to Maria, my trusted housekeeper. Maria had worked for our family for over 20 years. She had mourned my late wife with genuine heartbroken tears, and she absolutely despised the arrogant way Monica treated the household staff. I had explicitly instructed her to leave the kitchen back door unlocked and to temporarily bypass the magnetic alarm sensor on that specific entrance before she left for the weekend. I reached the heavy wooden service door, firmly grasped the cold brass handle, and turned it slowly to test the locking mechanism. The heavy door swung open with a soft, entirely silent glide. Maria had executed my precise instructions perfectly. We slipped quietly into the sprawling, dark kitchen, the familiar smell of expensive cleaning supplies and polished granite lingering heavily in the cool, conditioned air. Jonathan moved with a surprising fluid grace for a corporate attorney, securing the sturdy door behind us while Elias adjusted the heavy strap of his canvas messenger bag. The massive house was dead silent, holding its breath under the crushing weight of the secrets hidden inside. I led them down the long, deeply shadowed hallway corridor quickly. Walking silently through my own dark mansion felt exactly like stepping through an abandoned graveyard of broken memories. The soft, pale moonlight filtered gently through the tall, arched windows, casting long, ghostly beams across the polished hardwood floors. As we moved quietly past the grand sweeping staircase, my eyes drifted toward the gallery of family portraits, hanging perfectly on the velvet-lined walls. I saw framed photographs of Derek as a young child smiling brightly on a sunny beach in Florida. I saw proud pictures of him graduating from business school, standing tall beside me and his wonderful, loving mother. Those expensive framed images used to fill me with an overwhelming sense of deep paternal pride and lasting legacy. Now looking at them directly through the harsh lens of this brutal betrayal, they felt like mocking, empty illusions. The smiling boy captured in those photographs was a complete stranger, a highly dangerous predator simply wearing the stolen face of my son. I felt absolutely no lingering affection, no parental hesitation, and no soft grief. The last fragile remnants of my mercy had been incinerated. I felt nothing but a chilling, absolute resolve to excise this malignant cancer completely and forever. We finally approached the imposing solid oak doors of my private home office. The digital biometric scanner glowed softly, with a faint, steady red light, actively guarding the perimeter of the room. This was the exact spot where Monica had confidently used the fabricated silicone mold of my fingerprint just a few short hours ago. I did not need a stolen mold. I placed my right thumb firmly against the cool, smooth glass of the scanner. The machine beeped once, a sharp, validating sound, and the security indicator light instantly shifted from red to a bright, welcoming, glowing neon green. I pushed the heavy wooden doors open, allowing Jonathan and Elias to step inside my private sanctuary. The room was exactly as I had seen it on the hidden analog camera feed. The air felt uncomfortably heavy and stagnant, deeply tainted by the lingering, distinct scent of Derek's expensive designer cologne. The heavy mahogany panel covering the wall safe remained slightly ajar, a glaring testament to their arrogant, blind confidence. They firmly believed they had already won the war without a single shot being fired. They truly believed I would walk into this exact room tomorrow morning completely oblivious still. Elias did not waste a single precious second. He walked directly toward my large mahogany desk, completely ignoring the expensive framed artwork and the imported leather furniture. He dropped his heavy canvas messenger bag onto the polished wood surface and quickly pulled out his military-grade laptop. He began connecting a highly complex array of specialized diagnostic cables, routing them carefully toward the open wall safe. He moved with a practiced mechanical efficiency, completely unfazed by the terrifying gravity of the criminal situation. This was his unique battlefield, and he was an absolute undisputed master of his highly specialized trade. Jonathan immediately took charge of the physical evidence, reaching into the heavy steel safe with gloved hands. He pulled the cold wallets from their foam cutouts, passing them directly to Elias. The forensic accountant connected each drive to a multi-port hub attached to his military-grade laptop. The screen illuminated the dark office with a harsh green glow as the infiltration software engaged. Jonathan stood over him, dictating the precise offshore account numbers and routing protocols linked to Derek and Monica's hidden casino accounts in Macau. Elias typed with a frantic, mesmerizing speed, his fingers striking the keys in a blur of calculated motion. He was actively injecting a malicious script into the core architecture of the storage devices. This script would completely overwrite my forged digital footprints, permanently branding the cartel money with Derek's actual hardware signatures and Monica's personal banking metadata. I stood near the heavy oak doors, keeping my eyes fixed on the empty hallway outside. The silence of the house was absolute, broken only by the rapid clicking of the keyboard and the soft hum of the computer processor. We were executing the perfect counterstrike, turning their brilliant federal trap into an inescapable cage of their own making. The digital progress bar on the computer screen crawled forward with agonizing slowness. 50%. 60%. Elias explained in a low, raspy whisper that the cryptographic firewalls embedded in the cartel wallets were exceptionally robust. They required highly sophisticated brute force algorithms to bypass without triggering an automatic security lockdown. Jonathan watched the numbers climb, his jaw locked in intense concentration. He knew exactly what was at stake tonight. If we corrupted the drives or left a partial data fragment behind, the Federal Cyber Division would discover the tampering during their raid tomorrow morning. They would know someone had manipulated the evidence, which would inevitably cast a shadow of doubt over our entire defensive narrative. The rewrite had to be absolutely flawless. It had to look exactly like Derek had foolishly linked his own illicit accounts to the cartel money out of sheer greed and monumental arrogance. The progress bar reached 75%. I took a slow, deep breath, allowing the cool air of the office to fill my lungs. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a genuine sense of control returning to my grasp. The apex predator was finally reclaiming his territory. Then the sharp, sudden vibration of my mobile phone shattered the quiet concentration in the room. I pulled the device from my pocket, glancing down at the illuminated screen. It was a highly encrypted text message from Maria. The words displayed on the glass made the blood freeze in my veins. They forgot a designer purse. They are pulling into the main driveway right now. Get out immediately. I stared at the message, a sudden spike of pure adrenaline flooding my nervous system. I turned to Jonathan and Elias, my voice dropping to an urgent, commanding whisper. Derek and Monica are back. They are pulling into the driveway. We have less than 60 seconds before they walk through the front doors. Elias did not look up from his glowing screen. The progress bar was hovering at 89%. The digital rewrite is not finished, he stated flatly, his fingers flying across the keys to accelerate the processing speed. If I disconnect the physical cables now, the internal memory partition will instantly corrupt, and the drives will be entirely useless to the federal agents. We need more time. We do not have more time, I replied sharply. I stepped quickly toward the large bay windows on the far side of the room, peering through the heavy velvet curtains. The sweeping headlights of Derek's silver Porsche cut through the darkness of the front lawn, illuminating the manicured hedges and the decorative stone fountain. The vehicle lurched to a sudden halt directly in front of the main portico. The driver's side door popped open, and Derek stepped out into the humid night air. He was moving with a fast, irritated energy, clearly annoyed by the unexpected detour from their expensive celebration downtown. I watched him march toward the front entrance, pulling his keys from his tuxedo pocket. Inside the office, the progress bar on his laptop ticked to 94%. Jonathan was practically hovering over the machine, his hands ready to snatch the drives the absolute second the software completed its cycle. We could hear the heavy, distinct clack of the deadbolt echoing through the silent foyer. The massive front doors swung open. Derek and Monica's voices echoed loudly down the marble hallway, their footsteps striking the hard floor with a terrifying rhythmic proximity. They were walking directly toward the office corridor. I moved back to the center of the room, my eyes darting between the closed oak doors and the glowing computer screen. 96%. The voices in the hallway were growing louder, sharper. Monica was complaining about the delay, blaming Derek for rushing her out of the house earlier that evening. Derek muttered a harsh reply, his footsteps accelerating. He was heading straight for the library adjacent to my office, the exact room where Monica had left her designer purse. If he noticed the office doors were unlocked, or if he caught even a slight glimpse of the computer light shining under the doorframe, the entire operation would be completely ruined. 98%. The progress bar seemed to freeze, hovering at that agonizing number for what felt like an absolute eternity. Elias typed a rapid sequence of override commands, pushing the processor to its absolute maximum limit. The heavy footsteps stopped directly outside the office doors. I held my breath, every muscle in my body pulled completely taut. I could see the shadow of his shoes through the tiny gap at the bottom of the doorway. He was standing right there, 100%. The screen flashed a brilliant green, signaling the absolute completion of the digital rewrite. Jonathan moved with explosive, terrifying speed. He yanked the diagnostic cables directly out of the laptop hub, snatched the cold wallets from the desk, and forcefully shoved them back into their dense foam cutouts inside the steel lockbox. He pushed the heavy container deep into the bottom shelf of the safe and slammed the massive steel door shut. He spun the mechanical dial, violently locking the vault and securing the lethal evidence in total darkness. Elias folded his laptop shut, shoving the machine into his canvas bag in one fluid motion. The brass handle of my office door began to turn downward, a slow, agonizing rotation accompanied by the faint squeak of the metal latch. I grabbed Jonathan by the shoulder, shoving him toward the large open bay window at the rear of the room. We scrambled silently over the wooden sill, dropping down into the soft, damp soil of the garden bed below. Elias tumbled out right behind us, pulling the heavy glass pane down until it clicked shut with a soft, muted thud. We escaped into the shadows of the garden, breathless but totally victorious, as the ruthless trap snapped firmly around them forever. The cool night air of the garden gave way to the breaking dawn. I had spent the remaining hours of the early morning, sitting in the quiet corner booth of that same industrial diner, with Jonathan drinking endless cups of black coffee, while we meticulously reviewed every single detail of our defensive strategy. Elias had completely vanished into the city long before sunrise, his job executed with terrifying perfection. Jonathan had returned to his corporate office to prepare the impending legal filings. When the digital clock on my vehicle dashboard finally shifted to 6 in the morning, I drove toward a popular artisan bakery located just a few miles from my estate. I purchased a large, warm assortment of fresh bagels, a dozen decadent pastries, and a carrier of premium roasted coffee. These were the perfect physical props for my final performance. I was about to deliver the absolute role of a lifetime. I was going to play the sweet, gullible, clueless father who had simply decided to return home early to surprise his beloved children. At precisely 7 o'clock in the morning, I pulled my vehicle into the long circular driveway of my Buckhead estate. The silver Porsche was still parked near the main portico, its sleek metallic surface covered in a thin layer of morning dew. I gathered the heavy brown paper bags and the cardboard coffee carrier, balancing them carefully in my arms. I walked up the wide stone steps and pushed my key into the heavy front door. The grand foyer was perfectly silent, bathed in the soft, warm light of the early morning sun. I closed the door behind me with a loud, deliberate thud, allowing the sound to echo clearly up the sweeping marble staircase. I walked straight into the massive designer kitchen, set the bags of warm food onto the polished granite island, and began loudly opening the cupboards to retrieve our favorite ceramic mugs. It took less than 3 minutes for the noise to register upstairs. I heard the frantic, heavy thud of footsteps hurrying across the hardwood floor of the second-story landing. Derek and Monica tumbled down the staircase and burst into the kitchen. They both looked absolutely dreadful. Derek was wearing a wrinkled pair of sweatpants and a plain white t-shirt, his hair sticking up at odd angles. Monica was wrapped tightly in a thick silk robe, her face completely pale and devoid of her usual immaculate makeup. They froze the exact second they saw me standing casually by the coffee machine. Their eyes widened to the size of saucers, reflecting a sudden, terrifying spike of genuine panic. They were staring at me as if they had just seen a ghost materialize in their pristine kitchen. They fully expected me to be hundreds of miles away on a business trip, completely out of the picture, while the federal authorities prepared to storm the property. "Good morning, you two," I said, allowing a bright, enthusiastic smile to spread across my face. I brought fresh bagels and those blueberry pastries you both love so much. I poured a steaming stream of dark coffee into a mug and pushed it across the granite counter toward my son. "Dad." Derek stammered, his voice cracking slightly as his mind raced to comprehend my presence. "What are you doing here? I thought you were halfway to Chicago by now. What happened to your massive regional logistics conference?" I let out a soft, self-deprecating chuckle, waving my hand dismissively in the air. "Oh, you know how these corporate conferences are," I replied, keeping my tone incredibly light and breezy. I woke up in my hotel room at 4 in the morning, looked at the itinerary, and realized I could delegate the entire presentation to my senior vice president. "I'm getting too old to sleep in uncomfortable hotel beds, Derek. I missed my own home and I missed my family. So I caught the very first flight out of the city and drove straight here. But the real question is, what are you two doing here?" I turned my gaze toward Monica, projecting an expression of deep, innocent confusion. "Monica, sweetheart," I said softly, "I thought you were sitting in a hospital room in Miami. Is your mother all right?" I watched them scramble. It was fascinating to witness the sheer cognitive dissonance required to maintain their massive deception. Monica blinked rapidly, her chest heaving as she swallowed her panic and desperately reached for her fabricated narrative. "Oh, Robert," she gasped, pressing a trembling hand against her chest to simulate emotional relief. It was an absolute miracle. The doctors were completely wrong about the severity of the stroke. She woke up late last night perfectly lucid, and the neurological scans came back completely clear. They actually discharged her early this morning. I was so incredibly relieved that I booked a red-eye flight straight back to Atlanta. I just walked through the front door a few short hours ago. I smiled warmly, my eyes crinkling at the corners. "Well, praise God for that," I said, pouring a second cup of coffee for her. "I have been praying for her recovery non-stop. You both have been through such an incredible ordeal over the last 24 hours. I am just glad it is over. And what about your massive contract negotiation in London, Derek? Did you secure the logistics deal?" Derek aggressively cleared his throat, running a nervous hand through his messy hair. He stepped forward and picked up the mug of coffee, gripping it so tightly his knuckles turned white. "It was a complete disaster, Dad," he lied smoothly, his arrogant confidence slowly returning to his posture. "We were taxiing on the runway for almost an hour when the pilot announced a catastrophic mechanical failure with the left engine. They grounded the entire fleet. The airline could not rebook the upper-class cabin until late this afternoon. I was absolutely furious, but there was nothing I could do. I took a cab back to the house to sleep it off. I was going to call you when I woke up later today." "That is incredibly frustrating, son," I murmured sympathetically. "But honestly, I am just so happy that we are all together under one roof this morning. It feels like a true blessing from above." I picked up a warm bagel and watched my son very carefully. Derek took a sip of coffee and casually glanced down at his heavy silver watch. It was a seemingly innocent movement, but I caught the intense, burning anticipation hiding behind his eyes. He checked the time again. It was 7:15. He was salivating at the thought of the impending federal raid. He believed that heavily armed agents would soon shatter my front doors. He expected them to drag me out in iron handcuffs. He had absolutely no idea that I was simply waiting for the exact same clock to strike 8. The vicious trap was completely reversed. Absolute checkmate was finally coming right now. The next 45 minutes were an absolute masterclass in psychological endurance. I stood in my pristine designer kitchen eating my warm artisan bagel and sipping my dark roast coffee, engaging my treacherous son and his calculating wife in utterly mundane conversation. I asked Derek about the specific mechanical failures on his fictional London flight. He spun a highly detailed, incredibly convincing lie about a hydraulic leak in the landing gear, embellishing the story with frustrated complaints about airline customer service. I asked Monica about her mother and the miraculous recovery in Miami. She described the fictitious hospital room, the imaginary doctors, and her fake tears of joy with a level of theatrical commitment that was genuinely terrifying to behold. They were flawless liars. They possessed a chilling capacity to look me directly in the eyes, smile warmly, and casually discuss the weather while actively waiting for my entire existence to be violently dismantled. As the digital clock on the microwave slowly ticked toward the top of the hour, Derek became increasingly restless. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. His eyes darted constantly toward the large bay windows that overlooked the front lawn and the circular driveway. He tapped his fingers nervously against the granite countertop, a rapid, erratic rhythm that betrayed his escalating anticipation. He was practically vibrating with a dark, predatory energy. He truly believed he was standing on the absolute precipice of inherited corporate empire and total financial freedom. He believed the heavy burden of his massive gambling debts to dangerous offshore syndicates was about to be completely wiped clean by my public ruin. I calmly finished the last remaining sip of my coffee and placed the ceramic mug gently into the stainless steel sink. I stretched my arms slightly, letting out a contented sigh, playing the role of the relaxed, happily oblivious patriarch to absolute perfection. The heavy grandfather clock in the grand hallway began to chime its deep resonant tones echoing loudly through the silent estate. 1, 2, 3. It was exactly 8:00 in the morning. The tranquility of the humid Georgia morning shattered instantly. The violent, unmistakable sound of heavy rubber tires tearing aggressively across the loose gravel of my front driveway ripped through the air. It was not the slow, respectful approach of a delivery vehicle or a private courier. It was the rapid, aggressive surge of tactical vehicles moving with absolute coordinated purpose. Through the kitchen windows, I watched 3 massive jet-black government SUVs aggressively jump the front curb, their powerful engines roaring as they parked at sharp blocking angles directly in front of the main portico. Derek gasped loudly, a beautifully rehearsed sound of sudden panic. He rushed toward the large foyer with Monica trailing closely behind him, her hands pressed dramatically against her cheeks. I followed them at a much slower, more deliberate pace, maintaining the calm, confused posture of a man who simply did not understand the aggressive intrusion. The heavy oak front doors of my estate did not gently open. They were forcefully pushed wide by a coordinated team of 8 heavily armed federal agents. They poured into my grand foyer like a dark, relentless tide. They wore thick Kevlar vests clearly emblazoned with the bold yellow letters of the FBI and the IRS. Several agents carried tactical assault rifles, keeping the muzzles pointed carefully toward the marble floor. But their physical posture was overwhelmingly aggressive and completely unyielding. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a sharp, angular face and short gray hair stepped through the threshold leading the federal tactical team. He was wearing a standard dark suit under his protective vest, projecting an aura of absolute, uncompromising legal authority. His cold, analytical eyes immediately swept the grand foyer, instantly locking onto my face. Richard Harrison, the lead federal agent, barked, his powerful voice echoing harshly against the high, vaulted ceilings of the mansion. "I am Special Agent Thomas Vance with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, working in conjunction with the Internal Revenue Service Financial Crimes Division. We have a federal search warrant for this property, including all physical structures, digital networks, and personal vehicles located on the premises. We are executing an active, immediate search for massive financial irregularities, illegal offshore monetary transfers, and highly coordinated corporate money laundering." Derek lunged forward, placing his body defensively between me and the advancing federal agents. It was an Oscar-worthy performance, completely devoid of any hesitation or genuine fear. He raised his hands in the air, projecting an image of absolute outrage and deep protective filial loyalty. "What the hell are you people doing?" Derek shouted, his voice echoing with righteous, manufactured fury. "You cannot just kick down the doors of a private residence like this. This is the home of an incredibly respected corporate executive. Do you have any idea who my father is? He is a pillar of this entire community. You are making a massive, humiliating mistake." Agent Vance did not flinch or offer any polite apologies. He stood his ground, his expression remaining entirely stoic and completely unmoved by my son and his loud theatrical protests. "We are executing a lawful federal warrant, Mr. Harrison," the agent replied coldly, pulling a thick stack of folded legal documents from his jacket pocket and holding them out. "You will step aside immediately, or you will be placed under federal arrest for actively obstructing a federal investigation. Choose your next move very carefully." Derek turned his head slightly, looking back at me with wide, panicked eyes that perfectly mimicked deep, filial terror. He was incredibly good at this. He had spent his entire life practicing the fine art of emotional manipulation. "Dad!" Derek pleaded, his voice cracking with artificial desperation. "Dad, do not let them do this. You have to call your corporate lawyers right now. You have to stop them. How dare they do this to an older man? He has a severe heart condition, for God's sake. If you people cause him to have a medical emergency, I swear to you, I will personally sue the federal government and every single one of you in this room." "Please, Derek," I said softly, stepping forward and placing a gentle, reassuring hand on his tense shoulder. I maintained the calm, steady voice of a patriarch trying desperately to soothe his frightened family during a terrible misunderstanding. "Do not agitate the federal authorities. We have absolutely nothing to hide here. This is obviously a profound clerical error in their financial system. Let the federal agents do their job, and my corporate legal team will easily sort this out later today. There is no need for shouting or hostility in our home." Derek slowly lowered his defensive hands, releasing a heavy, shuddering breath of fake compliance. I watched his body language shift with a fascinating, calculated precision. While his face continued to project pure, protective outrage, his physical movements told a completely different story. He subtly stepped aside, clearing the direct pathway to the main corridor. He slightly angled his broad shoulders, unknowingly pointing his body exactly toward the heavy oak doors of my private home office. He was actively, silently guiding the wolves directly toward the carefully prepared slaughter. Monica moved quickly to stand right beside him, clutching his arm with trembling, manicured fingers. "Oh, Derek," she whimpered loudly, burying her face into his shoulder to hide the victorious, malicious smile that I knew was stretching across her deceitful face. "This is an absolute nightmare. How could this be happening to our family today?" Agent Vance ignored their dramatic display completely. He turned his attention back to me, his cold eyes scanning my relaxed posture with a hint of professional suspicion. "Mr. Harrison, we are going to secure the entire premises immediately," the agent stated firmly. "I need you and your family to remain seated in the main living room while my tactical team conducts their initial physical sweep of the primary structure. Do not attempt to use any cellular devices. Do not attempt to log into any computer networks, and do not attempt to leave the immediate designated area. Do you understand these federal instructions clearly?" I nodded slowly, my expression radiating calm, cooperative innocence. "I understand perfectly, Agent Vance," I replied in a smooth, respectful tone. "We will cooperate with your investigation entirely. We will wait in the living room while your agents search the house." Agent Vance gestured sharply to his tactical team. The federal agents immediately dispersed, moving rapidly and aggressively down the long, immaculate hallways of my sprawling estate. I watched them pass the valuable family portraits and the expensive imported artwork. I watched them march heavily toward the secluded corridor that housed my private sanctuary. I turned and walked slowly toward the living room, casually taking a seat on the soft white leather sofa. Derek and Monica sat directly across from me, holding hands tightly, continuing to perform their roles as deeply traumatized victims of a sudden, unjust federal intrusion. I simply folded my hands patiently in my lap, breathing in the quiet air, absolutely ready for the bomb to detonate. The agonizing wait in the main living room lasted for exactly 42 minutes. During that time, the heavy rhythmic thud of tactical boots echoed continuously from the second floor and the adjacent corridors. Derek sat perfectly still, holding Monica close to his side, his face a mask of manufactured distress. Every so often he would steal a quick, predatory glance in my direction. I kept my gaze fixed firmly on the intricate patterns of the Persian rug beneath my feet, projecting the image of a defeated, deeply confused patriarch. Suddenly, the heavy footsteps converged, and Agent Vance strode back into the living room. His angular face was completely devoid of emotion, but his posture radiated the sharp, focused energy of a predator closing in on its prey. "Mr. Harrison," the agent said, his voice cutting through the tense silence like a serrated blade. "My team has secured the primary structure. We have located a highly secure, biometric wall safe hidden behind the mahogany paneling in your home office. The parameters of our federal warrant require immediate, unrestricted access to that specific vault. I need you to unlock it right now." I lifted my head, allowing my eyes to widen in genuine bewilderment. "My safe?" I asked, letting my voice tremble slightly to sell the performance. "Agent Vance, there is absolutely nothing in that safe, except my personal legal documents, some old family heirlooms, and a few corporate succession contracts. I assure you, you are wasting your time." The agent did not smile. He simply gestured toward the hallway with a rigid hand. "Unlock the safe, Mr. Harrison," he repeated coldly, "or we will bring in a thermal breaching team and destroy the wall. The choice is entirely yours." I released a heavy, defeated sigh, slowly rising from the leather sofa. I slowly nodded my head in reluctant compliance. Derek immediately jumped to his feet, placing a supportive hand on my back. "We will come with you, Dad," he said smoothly, his voice dripping with fake filial concern. "We are not going to let them intimidate you." Monica followed closely behind us, wiping an imaginary tear from her cheek. We marched down the long corridor in a tight, silent procession, flanked by two heavily armed federal agents. The air in the hallway felt incredibly thick, suffocating under the weight of the impending revelation. When we finally reached my private home office, I saw that the heavy oak doors had been propped wide open. 3 tactical agents were already standing inside, their eyes fixed intently on the mahogany panel that had been slid back to expose the imposing steel face of my vault. I walked slowly toward the wall, letting my hands tremble visibly as I reached for the biometric scanner. I pressed my right thumb against the cool glass surface. The scanner beeped a sharp tone. The red security light instantly shifted to a bright, glowing green. I grasped the heavy metal dial, turned it to the final mechanical position, and pulled the thick steel door open. The heavy hinges groaned softly in the quiet room. The agents immediately stepped forward, gently pushing me aside to take absolute control of the search. Agent Vance reached into the dark velvet-lined interior of the safe. His gloved hands quickly located the 2 heavy steel lockboxes that Derek had so carefully planted just hours before. The agent hauled the containers out and placed them directly onto the center of my pristine mahogany desk. He produced a specialized heavy-duty lock-picking tool from his tactical vest, forcing the simple mechanical locks open in a matter of seconds. The lids popped back, revealing the exact contents my son had meticulously arranged. Thick stacks of forged offshore contracts printed on heavy corporate stationery sat perfectly beside a sleek row of advanced cryptographic cold wallets. Derek let out a sharp, perfectly timed gasp of manufactured shock. He wrapped his arm tightly around Monica, pulling her into his chest. From my peripheral vision, I watched my son aggressively bite down on his lower lip. He was not trying to hold back tears of disbelief. He was desperately trying to conceal a massive, triumphant grin that was threatening to split his face wide open. Monica buried her face against his collarbone, her shoulders shaking rhythmically as she pretended to sob uncontrollably at the sight of the damning evidence. They were putting on the performance of a lifetime, entirely convinced that the physical presence of those drives signaled my absolute unavoidable destruction. Agent Vance meticulously laid the cold wallets out in a neat row across the polished wood of my desk. He did not look at me, nor did he offer any preliminary questions regarding the illicit materials. He was a professional operating purely on digital verification. "Bring the decryption unit in here," Agent Vance commanded into the radio microphone clipped to his shoulder. Within moments, a specialized cyber forensics agent entered the office carrying a rugged, heavy-duty federal laptop. The machine was thick and encased in a matte black protective shell specifically designed to process encrypted financial data on site. The cyber agent set the laptop down beside the physical evidence and immediately booted up the system. The screen flared to life, casting a harsh, pale blue light across the serious faces of the federal investigators. Agent Vance carefully picked up the primary cold wallet, the exact drive that held the $12 million in untraceable cartel funds. He plugged the small metallic device directly into the side port of the decryption laptop. "We are initiating a preliminary metadata scan," Agent Vance stated, his voice flat and heavily clinical. "This process will verify the digital signatures, confirm the primary ownership routing numbers, and cross-reference the specific offshore accounts detailed in our anonymous tip. Once the primary digital registry is confirmed, you will be taken into federal custody, Mr. Harrison." I swallowed hard, projecting an image of pure, unadulterated terror. But internally, my pulse was remarkably steady. The room fell completely silent. The only sound was the faint, high-pitched whir of the federal laptop processing the complex encrypted data. The agonizing tension in the room was physically suffocating. The cyber agent typed a rapid sequence of operational commands, initiating the deep extraction protocol. A bright blue progress bar appeared in the absolute center of the computer screen, slowly creeping forward. Derek stood just 3 feet away from me, practically vibrating with electric anticipation. He was staring at that loading bar as if it were the Holy Grail, waiting for the exact moment the federal hammer would drop onto my life. I watched the reflection of the screen shining in his greedy eyes. 10%, 30%, 60%. The agents stood motionless, their hands resting cautiously near their tactical belts, fully prepared to restrain me the absolute second the verification was complete. Monica stopped her fake sobbing, her undivided attention now locked fiercely onto the monitor. 90%. The room held its breath. I kept my face frozen in a mask of total devastation, patiently waiting for the script to execute its brilliant destructive payload. 99%. The digital hammer was suspended and ready. The digital hammer was suspended and ready. Agent Vance stared intensely at the bright blue screen of his laptop. The loading bar struck 100%. The system chimed softly, indicating the metadata extraction was complete. The room remained completely frozen, trapped in agonizing silence. I watched the reflection of the data scrolling rapidly across the lenses of the agent's dark tactical glasses. His sharp face, previously set in a mask of aggressive, uncompromising authority, suddenly shifted. He frowned deeply, his thick eyebrows pulling together in genuine confusion. He leaned closer to the monitor, his fingers flying across the trackpad. He hit the refresh button, forcing the federal software to run the complex diagnostic check a second time. The machine whirred, processing the digital ledger with absolute unforgiving precision. Derek shifted his weight excitedly, vibrating with toxic anticipation. He was desperately waiting for the agent to pull a pair of handcuffs from his Kevlar vest and drag me out of my own home. Agent Vance watched the screen refresh. The results remained exactly the same. He slowly lifted his head, his cold, analytical eyes scanning the room. He did not look at me. He completely bypassed my existence entirely. He locked his intense, predatory gaze directly onto my son. Agent Vance pushed himself away from the heavy mahogany desk. He bypassed me completely, walking with heavy, deliberate steps straight toward the center of the office. He stopped exactly 2 feet in front of Derek. The smug, victorious anticipation on my son's face began to violently fracture, replaced by a sudden, creeping shadow of profound uncertainty. Derek blinked rapidly, instinctively, pulling Monica slightly closer to his side. Agent Vance reached to his tactical belt, unclipping a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The sharp metallic click echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Derek Harrison, the agent said, his powerful voice cutting through the heavy air with absolute, terrifying finality. "You are under federal arrest for massive wire fraud, international corporate money laundering, and criminal conspiracy to distribute illicit cartel funds." The words hung in the air, a devastating sequence of syllables that completely shattered the foundation of their treacherous reality. Monica gasped sharply, taking a sudden, terrified step backward, physically distancing herself from the man she had just been clinging to. Derek stood completely paralyzed. His mouth fell open, but no sound emerged. His brain actively refused to process the auditory information he had just received. The flawless, inescapable trap he had spent months meticulously designing to destroy my life had just violently snapped shut around his own neck. He stared at the cold steel handcuffs dangling from the agent's large hand, his perfectly engineered world crumbling into a million jagged pieces right before his very eyes. The profound paralysis broke. Derek's smug, aristocratic face contorted into a mask of absolute, unadulterated panic. A high, desperate sound escaped his throat. "No," he screamed, his voice breaking into a hysterical, high-pitched shrill. "No, this is completely wrong. You are making a massive, catastrophic mistake. Look at the safe. Look at the paper trail." He desperately pointed a trembling, frantic finger toward my desk, gesturing wildly at the thick stacks of offshore contracts laid out on the polished wood. "Read the documents, you idiot. His name is on the contracts. My father signed every single one of those offshore agreements. The money belongs to him. The shell corporations belong to him. He is the one laundering the cartel funds. Arrest him. Arrest him right now." He practically lunged toward the desk, his movements frantic and completely devoid of his previous arrogant composure. Two tactical agents immediately stepped forward, placing their heavy hands firmly on his shoulders to violently restrain him. Derek fought against their grip, thrashing wildly. I watched my son completely unravel, abandoning every shred of familial loyalty to save his own skin. He was openly begging the federal government to imprison his father, completely unaware of the digital snare that had already crushed his future. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cool, conditioned air fill my lungs. The time for playing the sweet, gullible, clueless father had completely expired. I allowed the heavy, slumping posture of a defeated old man to fall away entirely. I rolled my shoulders back, lifting my chin and straightening my spine until I stood at my full height. The indulgent, forgiving patriarch, who had spent 38 years making endless excuses for a disappointing child, simply ceased to exist in that room. In his place, the ruthless apex, corporate architect, completely reawakened. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us, with slow, measured, and infinitely predatory steps. My presence instantly dominated the heavy atmosphere of the office. Derek stopped his frantic thrashing. He looked at me, his wide, terrified eyes finally recognizing the immense, lethal shift in my demeanor. The soft, confused father he thought he could easily manipulate was gone. He was staring directly into the eyes of a corporate shark who had built a $400 million empire by devouring opponents who were vastly smarter and significantly more dangerous than a spoiled, gambling, addicted boy. I looked at him with an expression of pure, freezing Arctic ice. "My name is on the physical paper, Derek," I said, my voice echoing with a low, terrifyingly calm resonance that commanded absolute silence in the room. "But the physical paper is entirely meaningless in the modern era of high-stakes financial subterfuge." I watched his breath catch in his throat as the horrific realization of his monumental failure began to truly set in. The digital footprint on those cryptographic cold wallets, I continued smoothly, stepping even closer. "The specific internet protocol addresses utilized to initiate the massive transfer of those illicit cartel funds late last night are not registered to my secure home network. They are definitively registered to your personal burner device and directly linked to the specific media access control addresses of your private hardware. Furthermore, the secondary digital routing logs do not point to my corporate accounts. They bypass me completely and point directly into Monica's personal offshore shell company located in the Cayman Islands. You meticulously forged my physical signature, Derek, but you fundamentally failed to understand that the unyielding digital ledger is the only truth that truly matters to a federal auditor. You handed them the digital rope and I simply helped you tie the knot." Derek stared at me in complete and utter horror, his jaw trembling violently. He realized that the flawless infiltration they had celebrated all night was actually the exact moment of their absolute defeat. I slowly reached into the inner breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I pulled out a sleek secondary flash drive, holding it firmly between my fingers. I turned my gaze away from my ruined son and looked directly at the lead federal investigator. And just to eliminate any lingering procedural doubts regarding their profound guilt, "Agent Vance," I stated coldly, handing him the small device, "here is the pristine 4,000-pixel resolution video and audio recording of my son and his wife breaking into my secure safe late last night to physically plant this evidence. Checkmate." Agent Vance took the small black flash drive from my outstretched hand, his sharp eyes flicking from the digital storage device to my face. The heavy silence in the office was broken only by the frantic, ragged breathing of my son as he struggled uselessly against the firm grip of the two tactical agents. Agent Vance moved with deliberate efficiency. He plugged the secondary drive into his federal decryption laptop and opened the primary media file. The crystal-clear 4,000-pixel resolution video immediately filled the screen, broadcasting the undeniable truth into the center of the room. The crisp audio echoed off the mahogany walls, playing the exact conversation Derek and Monica had shared the previous night. The entire federal team stood motionless, watching the digital footage of my son and his wife actively picking the lock of my wall safe, laughing about my deteriorating heart condition, and viciously detailing their plot to frame me for their own international money laundering syndicate. Agent Vance watched the entire 3-minute clip without blinking. When the video finally concluded, he reached down and calmly closed the laptop. He turned his head, his cold, uncompromising gaze locking directly onto the trembling woman standing frozen by the doorway. Monica Harrison. Agent Vance stated, his voice ringing with absolute chilling authority. "You are also under federal arrest for criminal conspiracy, international wire fraud, and the active fabrication of federal evidence. Turn around and place your hands behind your back immediately." The flawless illusion of the perfect, sophisticated power couple disintegrated in a single violent instant. As a female tactical agent stepped forward and firmly grasped Monica by the wrist, the heavy steel handcuffs clicking shut with a sharp metallic snap, a primal sound of pure terror ripped from her throat. It was not a delicate, manufactured sob. It was a vicious, animalistic shriek of absolute desperation. The cool, calculating woman who had orchestrated my downfall completely lost her mind. "Get your hands off of me!" Monica screamed, thrashing wildly against the federal agent. She twisted her body, her perfectly styled hair falling into her face as she glared at her husband with an expression of pure, unadulterated venom. She did not look at him with the loving devotion she had faked just moments before. She looked at him like a trapped rat, desperate to chew its way out of a sinking ship. "This is all his fault," she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly through the mansion. "I had absolutely nothing to do with the cartel money. Derek is a degenerate gambling addict. He owes $10 million to the Macau triads. They threatened to kill him. They threatened to kill both of us if he did not wash their money through his father's company. He made me do this. He forced me to plant the evidence. The entire operation was his idea to save his own miserable life." Derek stopped struggling against his captors, his face already pale with panic flushed with a sudden explosive rage. The aristocratic mask completely shattered, revealing the vicious, selfish coward hiding underneath. He stared at his wife, absolutely stunned by the sheer velocity of her betrayal. "You lying, gold-digging manipulator!" Derek screamed back, the veins bulging aggressively against his neck. "You were the one who researched the offshore accounts. You were the one who hired the digital forgers to copy my father's signature. You wanted the estate. You wanted his corporate shares. Do not pretend you were a victim. You practically salivated when you realized how easily we could trigger the medical competency clauses and lock the old man away." I stood silently near my desk, watching the two people I had welcomed into my home completely destroy each other. It was a fascinating, deeply repulsive display of human nature. There was no honor between thieves. The moment the federal trap snapped shut, they instantly turned their fangs upon one another, desperately trying to trade the other for a slightly reduced prison sentence. They traded vicious insults and detailed criminal confessions unknowingly, providing the federal agents with enough verbal evidence to secure a decade of mandatory minimum sentences for both of them. Agent Vance did not interrupt their vicious argument. He simply raised a hand, gesturing to his tactical team. "Get them out of my sight," he ordered firmly. "Place them in separate transport vehicles. Do not let them coordinate their statements." The federal agents moved with immediate, overwhelming force. They grabbed Derek and Monica by their arms, physically marching them out of the home office. I followed closely behind my footsteps, steady and deliberate, on the polished hardwood floors. We moved through the grand corridor, passing the gallery of family portraits that now felt like relics from a completely different lifetime. The massive house echoed with their chaotic, desperate screams. Monica continued to shriek about the Macau triads, begging the agents for immunity in exchange for her full cooperation. Derek yelled vicious obscenities, fighting the agents with every single step, desperately trying to salvage whatever tiny fragment of dignity he mistakenly believed he still possessed. They dragged my son and his wife through the grand foyer, their expensive clothes rumpled and their faces contorted in absolute panic. The heavy front doors were pushed wide open, allowing the bright, humid morning sunlight to flood into the entryway. As we stepped out onto the wide stone portico, the true magnitude of their public destruction became entirely visible. The 3 black tactical vehicles were parked aggressively across the circular driveway, their red and blue emergency lights flashing silently in the early morning air. But the federal presence was no longer a secret. The loud commotion, the screeching tires, and the undeniable presence of law enforcement had drawn the immediate attention of the entire neighborhood. The sprawling estates of Buckhead were usually bastions of absolute privacy, but a spectacle of this magnitude could not be ignored. I stood on the top step of the portico, my hands resting calmly at my sides. I looked across the manicured lawns and saw dozens of my incredibly wealthy neighbors standing at the edges of their properties. Corporate executives and local politicians were watching the scene unfold with expressions of pure, horrified fascination. Some were holding their morning coffee cups, absolutely frozen in shock, as they watched Derek being aggressively shoved into the back of a federal transport vehicle in heavy steel handcuffs. Monica was fighting a female agent on the pristine green grass of my front lawn, her silk robe slipping off her shoulder. Her shrill voice carried clearly across the quiet street, broadcasting their massive criminal debts and profound moral failures for the entire neighborhood to hear. Every single lie they had ever told was being incinerated in the bright light of a federal arrest. I watched the agents finally secure the doors of the tactical vehicles, locking my treacherous son and his calculating wife inside cages of reinforced steel. The engines roared to life, signaling the absolute end of their reign of terror. The heavy, suffocating shadow they had cast over my life was permanently lifted. The war was officially over. The cool morning breeze drifted across the expansive, perfectly manicured lawn of my estate, carrying with it the sharp metallic scent of the heavy tactical vehicles. I walked slowly down the wide stone steps of the main portico, my leather shoes clicking softly against the concrete. The flashing red and blue emergency lights sliced through the quiet neighborhood, casting harsh, erratic shadows across the faces of my wealthy, horrified neighbors. They stood completely frozen at the edges of their pristine driveways, watching the absolute destruction of a corporate dynasty unfold in real time. The federal agents were thoroughly efficient, securing the perimeter and preparing for the immediate transport of their high-value targets. Monica was already locked securely inside the back of the second black cruiser. Her face was pressed against the reinforced tinted glass, her expression a ruined tear-stained mask of utter defeat. She was no longer the arrogant, calculating woman who had meticulously plotted my downfall. She was simply a desperate criminal, utterly trapped by her own boundless greed. I turned my attention toward the primary transport vehicle parked directly at the base of my circular driveway. Two large tactical agents were firmly holding Derek against the side of the heavy armored door, conducting a rigorous physical search before placing him inside the metal cage. The heavy steel handcuffs bound his wrists tightly behind his back, forcing his shoulders into an awkward, deeply uncomfortable position. He looked absolutely pathetic. His expensive, custom-tailored clothing was wrinkled and covered in dirt from his brief, violent struggle on the lawn. His perfectly styled hair hung limply across his forehead, soaked with the cold sweat of pure, unadulterated panic. When he heard my footsteps approaching on the gravel, he snapped his head up. His wide, bloodshot eyes locked onto my face, and the last remaining fragment of his manufactured pride completely evaporated. The reality of a mandatory federal sentence finally crushed his spirit. Derek broke down. He did not simply cry, he began to sob with a raw, guttural intensity that echoed miserably across the quiet street. His knees buckled, and he would have collapsed entirely onto the hard pavement if the two federal agents had not been actively holding him upright by his arms. He looked at me with the desperate, pleading eyes of a terrified child, completely forgetting the vicious, calculating monster he had been just an hour before. Dad Derek screamed, his voice cracking and tearing with hysterical desperation. "Dad, please, you have to help me. You have to stop them. Call your corporate lawyers right now. You have the money. You have the political influence. You can make this entire investigation go away. Please do not let them put me in that car. I am your son. Dad. Please, I am your son. You cannot let them take me." I stepped up to the side of the federal squad car, stopping exactly 3 feet away from his trembling, tear-soaked face. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I did not offer even a single microscopic fraction of paternal warmth or emotional comfort. I stared at him with an expression of pure, freezing, Arctic ice. I looked deep into his eyes, searching for the boy I had raised, the child I had protected and nurtured for over 30 years. But that boy was completely gone. He had been entirely consumed by his own toxic arrogance, his reckless gambling addictions, and his unquenchable thirst for unearned power. The man standing before me in federal handcuffs was a complete stranger. He was a dangerous, treacherous parasite who had actively plotted to ruin my life, steal my legacy, and lock me away in a federal penitentiary simply to clear his own massive, reckless debts. The profound emotional detachment I felt in that exact moment was absolutely absolute. I felt no pity. I felt no sorrow. I felt only the cold, sharp clarity of absolute justice. The federal agents paused for a brief moment, respectfully granting me the opportunity to deliver my final words to the man who had tried to destroy me. The entire neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. The silence was incredibly heavy, broken only by the quiet hum of the heavy vehicle engines and the pathetic, ragged sound of my son desperately gasping for air. I squared my shoulders, projecting the unyielding, dominant authority of an apex corporate titan who had just successfully executed the most critical hostile takeover of his entire life. "You gave up the right to call me Dad the exact moment you priced out my life to pay your massive casino debts," I stated, my voice ringing with absolute terrifying finality. Every single syllable I spoke cut through the morning air like a beautifully sharpened surgical blade. You sat at my dining table, drank my wine, and smiled in my face while you actively conspired with dangerous offshore syndicates to frame me for international money laundering. You thought I was a weak, oblivious old man who would simply step aside and allow you to steal a $400 million empire. You wanted my empire, Derek. You wanted the absolute power and the endless wealth that you were far too lazy to build yourself. Well, listen to me very carefully, because this is the absolute final lesson I will ever teach you. You get nothing. Derek whimpered, shaking his head frantically as tears streamed down his face, completely unable to accept the devastating reality of his total failure. The moment I discovered your treacherous little plot, I continued my tone completely merciless and devoid of any hesitation. I contacted my senior legal team. I have already completely voided your legal power of attorney. I have dissolved the corporate succession contracts. I have legally stripped you and your deceitful wife entirely from the family trust and the primary inheritance. You do not own a single share of my company. You do not have access to a single penny of my wealth. You are completely and utterly bankrupt. As Monica so eloquently said on that high-definition recording while breaking into my safe last night, the best thing is for me to rot. I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice to a lethal, piercing whisper that only he could hear. Let us see exactly how well you rot in federal prison, son. Derek unleashed a horrific, agonizing scream of pure despair, completely shattering the quiet dignity of the affluent neighborhood. The federal agents immediately pushed him forward, forcing his head down as they shoved him aggressively into the dark, reinforced back seat of the tactical SUV. The heavy armored door slammed shut behind him with a loud, absolute finality. I did not watch him thrash against the tinted glass. I simply turned my back on the vehicle, severing the toxic connection permanently. I walked slowly and deliberately up the wide stone steps of my grand estate, my posture perfectly straight and my head held incredibly high. Behind me, the powerful engines of the federal cruisers roared aggressively to life. I heard the heavy tires crunching against the gravel as the vehicles rapidly reversed, turning sharply and safely driving away, leaving me in peace. The storm had finally passed. The media frenzy, once insatiable and deafening, had retreated into the distant background, leaving only the quiet, productive hum of progress in its wake. It had been exactly 1 month since the federal agents stormed the gates of my estate and dismantled the treacherous coup that Derek and Monica had spent months constructing. They were currently sitting in holding cells facing 20 years in federal prison with no possibility of bail, their high-priced legal teams frantically clawing at a case that possessed absolutely no defense. They were trapped by their own digital fingerprints and their boundless, blinding greed. I walked into the main boardroom of Harrison Logistics, the towering glass structure that pierced the Atlanta sky. The silence here was not empty or cold. It was the heavy, comfortable silence of absolute control. I walked to the head of the long mahogany table, feeling the weight of the firm beneath my feet, a foundation built on decades of relentless effort. I was not broken by the experience, nor was I diminished by the betrayal. Instead, I felt entirely liberated. The rot had been excised, leaving only the healthy, functioning core of the empire I had spent 40 years building from nothing. I summoned Maria to the office. She entered with her characteristic humility, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She looked deeply surprised, clearly wondering why the founder of the firm wanted a private meeting with the woman who had managed his household for so many years. I pushed the final documents across the surface, the signatures required in Kuangmao 1_23.docx and Kuangmao 2_23.docx. Maria, your loyalty is the only reason I am standing here today, I said, watching her eyes widen with disbelief. You chose to protect this family, even when the family tried to tear itself apart. I am promoting you to head of estate operations, effective immediately. Included is a financial bonus that will ensure your family is cared for generations from now, alongside a secure, ironclad retirement trust. You are no longer just an employee. You are a partner in this sanctuary. Her eyes filled with tears, not of greed, but of genuine relief and profound gratitude. She had earned every cent. I spent the remainder of the morning interviewing the next generation of leadership. I brought in young, hungry, ethical executives who had been passed over by Derek's corrupt cronies. They possessed the fire I once held, the integrity required to steer this ship, and a work ethic that demanded excellence rather than shortcuts. They understood that the company was a living organism, not a piggy bank for the entitled. The air in the office felt lighter, cleansed of the toxic ambition that had nearly poisoned my life's work. I sat at my desk and looked around, seeing only potential and genuine innovation. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling glass window, staring out at the vibrant Atlanta skyline. The city stretched out before me, alive and sprawling. I took a slow sip of my black coffee, the bitterness perfectly grounding me against the memory of the past. The empire stood stronger than it had in years, the gears turning with renewed efficiency. The lesson was simple, written in the debris of my son's failed coup. A wolf never, under any circumstances, lets the sheep take the throne, no matter how much they might look the part. Wolves see the truth that sheep simply choose to ignore, and a wolf never sleeps while the perimeter is breached. The view from the top is only beautiful if you have the absolute strength to hold it without any mercy. The empire remains mine because I am the only one left standing on the mountain that truly matters. My reign over this vast business landscape is finally truly secure for the next 30 glorious years of my active life. We spend our entire lives building empires to protect our children, shielding them from the very struggles that forged our own strength. But when you give someone the world without making them work for it, you don't breed gratitude. You cultivate dangerous entitlement. True loyalty is never defined by bloodlines or shared last names. It is proven through actions when no one is watching. Never allow blind love to paralyze your intuition. When those you trust most reveal their true darkest nature, you must have the absolute courage to believe them. You need the ruthless strength required to protect yourself. If this story of betrayal and justice kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that subscribe button right now. Have you ever faced betrayal from someone you completely trusted? Share your survival story in the comments below. Stay tuned for more gripping tales of resilience and ultimate revenge.